Hi everyone, welcome to another Preschoolers Explore STEM. My name's Miss Vinise, and today we're going to do a fun STEM project that involves getting a little bit messy. But before we dive into our project, do you guys remember what STEM stands for? That's right. S is for science, T is for technology, E is for engineering, and M is for mathematics. Well, just like last month, we're going to explore S, the science. And just like last month, we're going to explore biology because we have a very fun single-cell organism that we're going to look a little bit deeper into. And that single cell organism that we're going to focus on today is yeast. Yeast is used a lot in baking because yeast converts, which means it changes one thing into another. It converts sugar and starch into two gases, carbon dioxide and ethanol. And carbon dioxide is what makes the bread rise when you use yeast in baking things like bread. And in fact, I think our project today is baking bread. Are you guys ready? Do you have your kit? I don't have my kit. I'll be right back. I'm gonna go get my kit. If you don't have your kit yet, come to the Pittsburgh Community Library's Children's Reference Desk. You can either tell us that you need a kit and need to sign up, or if you've already signed up, just let us know and we'll hand you the kit right over. I'm gonna go get my kit. I'll be right back. All right, I got my kit from the Pittsburgh Community Library. Let's see what's in it. For our Yeast to Yummy kit, we have a baking tray. We can set that aside. A set of instructions, very important, so we know what we are doing today. Another gallon plastic bag. The star of the show, yeast. 1, 2, 3 cups of flour. 1, 2, 3. Does this look like a cup to you? Could you drink out of this? No. This isn't a cup that we drink from. A cup is also a standard of measurement. I have it right here. So everything below this line inside of this glass container is 1 cup. We use cups to measure liquids and smaller powders such as flour, salt, baking soda, cocoa powder. The form of a cup is used a lot in baking. And that's what we're doing today. Ooh, I got one more thing in my kit. Let's see. 3 tablespoons of sugar. This doesn't look like a spoon. It doesn't even look like 3 spoons. This isn't what I would eat my soup with. What do I mean by 3 tablespoons of sugar? Well, just like the cup of flour, a tablespoon is a form of measurement. So I have 1, 2, 3 tablespoons of sugar in each one of these containers. So these are all the things that come in your kit. The flour, the sugar, the plastic bag, the instructions, the yeast, and a baking pan. There are a few items you're going to need at home. You'll need vegetable oil or olive oil. Both of them work great for this recipe. some salt, and I have salt right here in this little jar. You'll need a measuring cup, and this is my measuring cup for 1 cup. A tablespoon and a teaspoon. Did you know that 1 tablespoon equals 3 teaspoons? So 3 of these, 1, 2, 3, could fit in here. You'll also need some warm water. And when I say warm water, I mean very warm, but not boiling. So you don't want it so hot you can't touch it. I can touch my water. But you want it to be a little bit warmer than a nice warm bath. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. So I've got my water, my oil, my salt, my measuring cup, my measuring spoons, and we'll need an oven. And I have that upstairs. I think we're almost ready to get baking. But before we bake, I wanted to show you a little bit more about yeast. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to do a whole separate experiment. Now, this isn't an experiment for you to do at home unless you have these supplies at home. I'm doing this just to show you what the difference is with yeast versus not using yeast. So I have 1 cup that I'm going to put yeast in, and I have another cup. We'll just leave the yeast right out. The reason why I don't want you to use the yeast and the sugar that I gave you in your kit is because you'll need that for baking bread. So this is what yeast looks like. It looks kind of like tan sand that's a little bit looser. So I'm going to put a little yeast inside 1 cup and leave the other cup without yeast. Everything else I want the same. So I'm going to put a little bit of sugar inside this cup with the yeast. There you go, yeast. And because I want everything else other than the yeast to be the same, I'm also going to put some sugar inside this cup. Next, to activate the yeast, it's going to need some warm water. So I'll add a little bit of warm water to this cup. And since I want it to be the same other than the yeast, I'm going to add some warm water to this cup. And I'll kind of stir these around a little bit by moving it in circles. So I have 1 cup with water, yeast, and sugar, and the other cup is just sugar water. Remember in the beginning of this video how I said yeast releases a gas called carbon dioxide and ethanol? Well, let's see if it releases enough of that gas to blow up a balloon. And the way we're going to test that out is I'm going to put a balloon over each one of these cups. Now, remember, one of the cups doesn't have any yeast. So I don't think that just water and sugar is going to create a gas. Here we go. Let's do this very carefully so I don't spill over my yeast concoction. So the orange balloon container will be over my cup of, let's call it yeast water. And the blue balloon will be over the cup that does not have yeast. All right, let's make some bread dough. In each one of your kits, I have included some instructions or a recipe on how to make this bread and a bag. The bag is the most important item because we're going to use this to make our bread dough. Have you ever baked or cooked in a bag before? It's a lot of fun. Still a bit messy. We'll get to the messy part in just a little bit. So step 1, we are going to combine which means put it all together, 1 cup of flour, so 1 of these bags. In you go, flour. 3 tablespoons of sugar for the whole container. 1 entire packet of yeast. And if you'd like to, you can flick it just like I am to try to get all the yeast down to the bottom corner. So when I rip open this corner, all the yeast doesn't come flying out. So I've ripped open a small hole in the yeast bag, and I'm gonna pour it all in here. Make sure I really get it, so I'm gonna flick it again. All right. I'm going to close my Ziploc bag, totally closed, and I'm gonna shake. Kind of bounce everything around so we mix the sugar, the flour, and the yeast up really well. And the final step we're gonna do before we give our baking a little bit of a short break is we're gonna add 1 cup of that very warm water. So I'm gonna pour water all the way up to the line that has a great big 1. And that's how I'll know it's 1 cup. This part you have to be a little bit careful. So I'm gonna hold my bag open a little bit like this. You can always have a grown-up help you with this as well. I'm gonna pour that water right into my bag. Hopefully my bag doesn't have any holes. Doesn't look like there's any holes. I'm going to zip the bag closed because we're gonna need to mush all of our ingredients together. Just like this. So it's kind of creating a tan, yellowish goop. I'm going to let my tan, yellowish goop sit here for 10 minutes. This is a very important step. We got to get that yeast a little bit more awake and get it more active. So we're going to let it rest for a little bit. In those 10 minutes, we'll know if our yeast is working because the carbon dioxide it creates will form bubbles inside our dough. So we want to look for bubbles. I already see some bubbles forming in my dough. All right, well, I'll see you in 10 minutes. So go ahead and pause this video, let your dough rest, and then after 10 minutes, unpause the video and we'll go on to the next step. All right, hopefully we all let our bread dough rest for 10 minutes so our yeast had a chance to start the process of changing the starch, which is the flour, and the sugar into carbon dioxide and ethanol. And both of those gases are what makes bread fluffy. We can move on to the next part of our recipe. Go ahead and carefully open your bag up again. Oh, mine is very gloppy and gooey. You're going to want to make sure that your bag can stay open but isn't spilling all of its contents out. The next step is we're going to take 1 more cup of flour. I'm going to pour it right inside the bag. Here we go. Get out of there, flour. Into the bag. All right. We're also going to want to add 3 tablespoons, which is my larger one, of oil. And that's why I'm going to want to make sure my bag is standing up so I can pour very carefully right over my bag. So I've got 1, 2, and 3 tablespoons of oil. The last thing we're going to want to add before we start squishing it back up again is 1.5 teaspoons, which is my smaller one, of salt. Now for the salt, you can add a little bit more if you like saltier foods, or if you like things to be a little less salty, you can always just do 1 teaspoon of salt. So I've got my 1.5 teaspoons of salt, my 3 tablespoons of oil, and my additional cup of flour in there. I think it's time to zip the bag up, and we are going to mush it around. I got all of the new ingredients we just put in there pretty well mixed up. So our next step is to open the bag again. Oh, it's definitely getting thicker. It's not as goopy anymore. It's still pretty goopy. Let's add another cup of flour. And this is our final cup of flour. Here we go. Oh, there goes all the flour. I'm going to close the bag up again, and this time I'm going to keep squishing it, but this time I'm going to be looking out to make sure I don't see any big areas of just flour. So what I mean by that is, on my bag, I can see there's a lot of flour right there, so I'm going to squish it. Just to make sure all the ingredients are mixed well together. I can also see that there's some loose flour right at the top. So I'm going to keep squishing. I don't want to over squish though, because if you squish too much, then you overwork the dough. What does overworking dough mean? That means that you've kneaded it and pressed it and squished it so much that the gluten isn't as stretchy and the yeast won't be able to make those nice carbon dioxide bubbles, which makes the bread fluffy. Basically, you squish your bread too much, you're going to have really thick, tough bread. And we want fluffy, light, and soft bread. All right, I have my dough mixed pretty well in there. I'm going to remove everything off of the table and wipe down the table to get ready to knead my bread dough. I'll be right back. All right, I cleared almost everything off of the table, and you might notice that I brought out some flour. The flour is going to help us knead the dough without it becoming so sticky that we can't move the dough around. Our goal right now is to knead and fold the bread dough so it makes a nice loaf shape. The way we're going to do that is I'm going to take this flour. Here comes the messy part. I'm going to spread it all over my table. I'm going to leave this extra flour right here. I'll move the flour off to the side so I have some space to work. And I'm going to cover the table with flour using my clean hands. So now both me and the table are covered in flour. You do want your hands covered in flour for the next step. We're going to take the bread dough bag and very carefully flip the whole bag inside out. Oh, this is going to be so messy. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Plop. I'm going to go ahead and take the extra little chunks of dough that I see stuck to the inside of the bag off with my floured hands. The reason why I made sure my hands were covered in flour is so the bread dough won't stick to my hands like it's stuck to this bag. All right, I think I got most of the bread dough off the bag. You don't have to get all of it off. Carefully turn the bag right side in again, and you can go ahead and throw that bag right out. I'm going to put it right off to the side. All right, we have our dough. It might feel very sticky and damp right now, but that added flour that we put on the table, or if you're doing it on the counter, will help make it a little less sticky. If you notice that it's really sticky, just put a little bit more flour on the table. Plop it right down on there. If it's sticking a lot to your hands, you can always put a little flour on your hands. And what we're going to do is we're going to knead, which is press, fold, press, fold, get the dough nice and mixed. So your goal here is to make sure that your dough is still nice and soft, a little bit sticky and wet. You don't want it too dry. Into a nice cylinder shape, a shape that will fit into here. So if you guys would like to see my dough, this is my dough. Still stretchy, still soft, like a soft Play-Doh, not quite as wet as slime. And into my baking tray. If you had a little extra oil left over, you can of course put a little bit of a layer of oil on the bottom of the baking tray to prevent sticking. But these baking trays, they're disposable, so you don't have to use the oil if you don't want to. The next step is very important for the yeast. We need to give the yeast time to create all those carbon dioxide bubbles inside the bread to make it rise. As you can see, our yeast right here inside my yeast water mixture has created a lot of carbon dioxide to the point where it actually blew up the balloon to the point of standing up. We're gonna want that same reaction inside our bread. Of course, our bread is much heavier and it has the starch in it as well, so it's not gonna blow up like a balloon. To make sure the yeast doesn't get too cold and that there isn't too much of a breeze, we're going to cover our bread for those 30 minutes with a kitchen towel and keep it away from cold breezes or cold air. We want to keep our bread in a nice room temperature environment underneath the blanket, like it's taking a little nap before it goes into the oven. Well, we've got 30 minutes to let our bread rise. So why don't we clean up everything, preheat our ovens to 375, go ahead and pause this video, and then after 30 minutes, you can click it back on. We'll see how much our bread has risen. Fingers crossed it rises a lot. And then we'll put it in each of our ovens. All right, I'll see you guys soon. All right, it's been 30 minutes. Let's see if our yeast formed enough carbon dioxide bubbles inside our bread dough to make it rise up. So it's almost like the yeast is releasing all these tiny little bubbles, and it's making the flour expand because the flour inside is holding all these itty bitty baby bubbles. Let's see. Dun 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 dun! Wow, it totally did. My bread, it wasn't above the pan before, but now it is. It's risen like a whole, I would say 35–40%. That looks great. So you know your yeast has worked if your bread actually looks like it's bigger than when you put the towel on it about 30 minutes ago. And in fact, this looks so good, I think it's ready for the oven. I'm gonna go and put it in the oven for about 25 to 30 minutes and make sure it's a nice golden brown. I'll take it out and I'll show you guys. I'll be right back. It was even more while it was baking, and this is a nice brown color to aim for when you're baking your bread. And all of the rise from this bread came from yeast. So let's go over what we had learned a little bit today while baking bread. We learned that yeast is a single cell fungi, which is like this, like mushrooms. Mushrooms are a fungus, truffles are a fungus, but it's an organism that feeds off of sugars. With the jar experiment, the one with the balloon, the yeast ate the sugar and it released a gas called carbon dioxide. The gas had filled the jar, and as more and more gas was created, it filled up the balloon, and that's why the balloon blew up. In our bread dough, the carbon dioxide from the yeast gets trapped in the gluten of the flour. And then the yeast dies in the hot oven, leaving the gluten kind of solidified into this soft bread. And that's why it's so airy and fluffy, is those bubbles that are created from the yeast. Well, I hope you guys had fun. I hope you enjoy your bread. And next month, we'll have another experiment or project to do. Bye.